to hold the loose paper. Then she dipped her finger very slowly into the pan, feeling the warmth of the steam on her hand, and letting her finger linger in the coffee until she could not bear it any longer. When she put it to her mouth, she closed her eyes and felt a drip slide down her chin. It was the coolness of her lips she tasted more than anything. It was a surprise when one of the Germans spoke, in French, so that Bernard could understand him. She opened her eyes with a start and popped her finger from her closed lips. She could not think what he might want. Even at 30, in her prime, she was not beautiful. Her hair was already thin and her skin faded. Her hands were wretched. No one spoke to her much, except God. "Come in, sister. We will not disturb you," said the German. Bernard half turned from the brewing coffee, beginning to smile. She twisted her wet finger in the folds of her habit, and she tried to quieten the monotone rumble of God preaching in her head. She stepped through the doorway to the refectory where the soldiers were waiting. It was like somewhere new. The sun coming in through the long windows, and the table shrunk by the bulk of the men. Their uniforms somehow exotic, and the temptation still tingling on her tongue. Bernard gulped down a stuttered breath. But he had not been speaking to her. They were all looking towards the back door, where Sister Jean had paused at the side of them, unsure. "Entrez, entrez," he said again, his accent sharp. "I have come for the pig scraps, monsieur," she said, blinking at the unfamiliar need to explain her routine. He got up and went to the door, pulling it more fully open and standing to one side, his arm outstretched into the refectory, inviting in the nun. He bowed, low and loose, grinning. One or two of the other soldiers applauded. Still, Sister Jean stood outside. "Come on then, come on," he said again. Sister Jean did not move. The German looked at her for a moment, no longer smiling, and shook his head. He stepped towards her and pulled at her arm, yanking her across the threshold. She stumbled. He slammed the door behind her and brushed his hands together, ignoring her now as he went back to his place at the table. Sister Jean winced, the idea of pain keeping her bent over for a moment. And then she passed through to the kitchen, her steps hurried and her eyes fixed on the floor, the empty sack slumped behind her like old skin. The soldier whistled quietly, and somebody laughed. "What are they doing?" Sister Jean stood close to Bernard and piled the leftovers from the bucket into the sack. It swelled on the floor between them. She watched exactly what she was doing, did not even glance at the men. "They're having coffee, sister. They're waiting for someone who was with Mother Catherine. It's their commandant, I think." Bernard was embarrassed by the hiss of Jean's question. "They've been very quiet. They've been no trouble." Sister Jean pulled tight the neck of the sack and kicked the bucket back towards the sink. It was noisy on the stone floor. "They're drawing straws." Bernard could not see how she had known this. There was hardly a movement between the soldiers. "Pigs," spat Sister Jean, dragging the sack out into the refectory again. The men did not stir this time as she passed. Bernard took the pan from the heat. The handle was insecure and her hand unsteady, and she walked slowly with it far in front of her as she took the coffee to them. Two of the soldiers parted, pushing back so that she could fill their glasses, and Bernard held the pan high over the table between them before pouring a measure evenly into each glass. She did not spill anything. Some of them thanked her, and though her hand trembled, God was silent. Later, when the Germans were preparing to leave, the soldier who had helped Bernard with the coffee brought his empty glass to the sink where she was scraping carrots. He stood for a moment at her side, and she paused in her work. She turned towards him. She saw how young he was, perhaps only 20, and she saw the perfect blueness of his eyes, an intimation of divinity. Smiling, he pulled her veil back from her face, as though to take a better look, and then he leant towards her and whispered something softly in her ear in German. She did not understand what he said, but she blushed anyway, surprised at the intimacy of the coffee on his breath. As he left her, he tossed away the short end of matchstick. One of the other soldiers nudged him. Smoke hung low from the house fires, and the air was thick. The shutters were